The picture looks normal at first. Two girls in matching white dresses, their arms linked, smiling at the camera in a bright Chicago studio. But one small detail stuck in the curator's mind: the shoes did not match. Margaret Holloway had worked at the Chicago Historical Society for 17 years, and she had organized thousands of family portraits from the city's early 1900s photography studios. She knew what fit and what did not. This image had arrived in a donation box from an estate sale on the South Side, mixed in with record books, letters, and advertising materials from a long-closed child welfare agency called the Illinois Home Finding Association. The girls looked about 8 or 9 years old. Their hair was curled and pinned the same way. Their dresses were identical, all the way down to the lace collar and puffed sleeves. They stood against a painted background of a garden scene, the kind that was popular in studio photos of that time. Everything about the picture suggested wealth and care, everything except the shoes. Margaret pulled the photo closer under the magnifying lamp in her conservation lab. The girl on the left wore leather button-up boots that looked polished and new. The girl on the right wore something else entirely. At first glance, they looked similar, but under the glass, Margaret could see the difference. They were rough canvas stitched by hand with uneven seams. The toe area sagged a little. The sole appeared to be layered fabric instead of leather. These were institutional shoes, the kind made in workshops when money was low. Margaret turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "The Moyer twins placed together. June 1919, success story for annual report." But if these were twins from the same family, why would one have store-bought boots and the other handmade institutional shoes? Margaret set the photo down carefully. This was not just a pretty old picture. Something here was wrong. Margaret had spent nearly 2 decades examining photographs that families wanted to forget or organizations wanted to change. She had seen images removed from collections because they showed uncomfortable truths about work conditions, racial separation, or the treatment of immigrants. She had learned to read photographs the way a detective reads crime scenes. Every object, every look, and every space told a story, and often that story went against the caption. She adjusted her scanner and took a high-quality digital picture of the print, then carefully removed it from its cardboard backing. The backing itself was printed material from the Illinois Home Finding Association with fancy borders and text that read, "Building Christian Families Through Child Placement." The studio stamp on the front identified the photographer as Lindholm and Sons, a commercial business that had operated on South State Street from 1915 to 1923. Margaret looked at the girls' faces again. They were smiling, but their eyes showed something else. The girl with the good boots looked directly at the camera with an easy, practiced look. The girl with the canvas shoes looked slightly to the side, her smile tighter, her body stiffer. Margaret had seen that look before in photographs of children from orphanages and industrial schools. It was the look of someone told to smile, but not sure why. She pulled out her notes on the Illinois Home Finding Association. The group had been started in 1907 by a group of church leaders and reformers who believed that poor children without parents should be taken out of large institutions and placed in country homes where they could learn honest work and good values. The agency had run for 2 decades before quietly closing in 1927. This photograph had been part of their ads. Margaret felt the heavy duty of doing what was right. She could file this image with a simple description and move on. Or she could follow the questions that were starting to form. If these girls were not really twins, what were they? And why would a child welfare agency fake a photograph to make it look like they were? Margaret started with the obvious clues. She pulled the city directories for 1919 and found Lindholm and Sons at 438 South State Street, in the middle of Chicago's photo district. The studio focused on family portraits and business work. Their ads in the Tribune promised dignified photos for families, schools, and charities. She checked the Illinois Home Finding Association's address and found their office had been on West Adams Street, just a few blocks from Hull House and the other aid organizations that filled Chicago's reform scene in the 1910s. Being close by was not an accident. These agencies formed a network sharing money, donors, and ideas about how to handle the city's poor. Margaret contacted a coworker at Northwestern, a historian named Dr. Robert Chen, who studied social welfare movements of that time. She scanned the photograph and sent it to him with a short explanation. He called her back within an hour. "I know this organization," Robert said. His voice sounded careful. The Illinois Home Finding Association was part of the Orphan Train Network, but they worked differently than the New York groups. They focused on placing kids locally within Illinois and nearby states. They advertised a lot in church papers and rural newspapers, promising families a source of help around the house in exchange for raising needy children properly. So it was placing people for work, Margaret said. Officially it was adoption or foster care, Robert replied. But yes, basically it was labor placement. The children were expected to work. The agency called it character building. Girls went to farms or middle-class homes to do housework, laundry, and cooking. Boys went to farms for field work or to shops to learn a trade. Some families treated the children well, many did not, and the agency did not watch closely once a child was placed. What about twins? Margaret asked. Would they stage photographs to make unrelated children look like siblings? There was a pause. I have seen ads from similar agencies that highlight sibling groups, Robert said slowly. The sales pitch was that taking two children was better than one because siblings could comfort each other, and the family would get twice the work for only a small increase in cost. But I've never seen proof of agencies making up sibling relationships. If that is what this is, it would be important. Margaret thanked him and went back to the public records. She searched for the name Moyer in Cook County records, looking for twins born around 1910 or 1911. She found 3 sets of Moyer twins in that time frame, but none matched the dates. 2 sets had died as babies. The 3rd set were boys. She expanded her search to orphanage and institutional records. The Chicago Orphan Asylum had books digitized at the Newberry Library. She asked for access and spent an afternoon scrolling through intake records. No Moyer twins. She tried the Illinois Soldiers and Sailors Children's School. Nothing. The Protestant Orphan Asylum. Nothing. Then she found something in the records of the Cook County Juvenile Detention Home, a temporary place where children were held while courts decided what to do with them. In May 1919, a girl named Lena Moyer, age 9, had been moved from the detention home to the Illinois Home Finding Association after her mother was sent to the women's prison in Joliet for theft. No mention of a twin, no mention of any siblings at all. Margaret checked the census records for 1910 and 1920. In 1910, Lena Moyer appeared as a 1-year-old living with her mother, Alice Moyer, in an apartment on the west side. Alice worked in a clothing factory. No father was listed and no other children. In 1920, Alice Moyer was listed at the Illinois State Reformatory for Women, and Lena was gone from the public record entirely. So, Lena Moyer had been a real child alone, placed by the agency in June 1919. Who was the other girl? Margaret contacted the archivist at the Newberry and asked if they had any more materials from the Illinois Home Finding Association. The archivist, a woman named Patricia Kwan, told her that a small collection had been donated in the 1970s by the daughter of one of the agency's board members. The collection had never been fully organized. Patricia agreed to get the boxes. Margaret spent the next 2 days at the Newberry working through crumbling letters, money ledgers, and stacks of photographs. She found contracts, hundreds of them, standard forms with blanks filled in by hand. The forms were titled Agreement for the Temporary Care and Christian Training of a Child. They stated that the receiving family would provide food, shelter, and education in exchange for the child's work in house or farm tasks. The contracts ran for periods of 1 to 3 years, renewable if the family and agency agreed. The children received no pay. At the end of the contract, the family could choose to legally adopt the child or return them to the agency. She also found letters between the agency's director, a man named Reverend Harold Trimble, and various donors and board members. In one letter dated March 1919, Trimble outlined a plan to increase donations by making a new annual report with photos of successful placements. He wrote, "Donors respond best to images of children doing well in their new homes, especially when siblings are placed together. We must produce strong visual stories that show our methods work." Margaret found another letter, this one from the agency's bookkeeper to Reverend Trimble, dated May 1919. It noted that the agency had only 3 sibling groups available for placement that spring, and 2 of those groups were boys, who were unlikely to appeal to families looking for house help. The bookkeeper suggested they focus advertising efforts on individual girls who were in higher demand. Yet, in June 1919, the agency had produced a photograph of twins. Margaret returned to the pile of photographs. Most were individual portraits of children, stiff and formal. A few showed children with their new families posed in front of farmhouses or in living rooms. Then she found a second print of the same photograph of the 2 girls, but this one had a different caption on the back. Lena M. and Dorothy K. Successful double placement demonstration for donors. June 1919. Dorothy K. Margaret returned to the juvenile detention records and found her. Dorothy Kowalski, age 8, transferred to the Illinois Home Finding Association in April 1919 after her father died in a factory accident and her mother was hospitalized for tuberculosis. No siblings, Lena Moyer and Dorothy Kowalski were not twins. They were 2 unrelated girls pulled from the detention system, dressed in matching clothing, and photographed together to create the look of a sibling placement. The Illinois Home Finding Association had staged the image to appeal to donors and future families. But why were the shoes different? Margaret contacted Dr. Chen again and asked him to meet her at the Newbury. When he arrived, she showed him both versions of the photograph and the records she had found. He studied the images carefully, then leaned back in his chair. "The shoes tell the story," he said. "They didn't have matching shoes, so they made do, or maybe they did it on purpose, thinking no one would notice. Look at the dresses, those are new, probably bought specifically for the photograph." The agency would have had a small collection of nice clothing for advertising purposes, but shoes were expensive. They couldn't justify buying 2 pairs of matching boots for a single photograph. So they put Lena, the girl who had been in the system longer, in institutional shoes, and Dorothy, the newer arrival, in whatever she had come in with, or, Margaret said slowly, Dorothy's boots were borrowed or bought, and Lena's shoes show that she had already been in the institution long enough to be given the standard orphanage footwear. Robert nodded. Canvas shoes stitched from scrap fabric were standard issue in state orphanages and detention homes. They were cheap to make and they wore out quickly, which meant children were constantly making new pairs in the workshops. It was considered work that built character. Girls sewed shoes and fixed clothing. Boys worked in wood shops or the gardens. Margaret thought about the 2 girls standing in the studio, arms linked, told to smile for the camera, Lena in her canvas shoes, Dorothy in borrowed boots. Both of them were props in an advertising campaign designed to get money from donors and get work from children. She asked Robert if he knew what a double placement meant in the context of the agency's work. "It meant placing 2 children with the same family," he said. "The selling point was efficiency. 1 family, 2 workers. The agency could clear 2 cases at once, and the family got a better return on their investment in terms of work hours. It was presented as an act of charity, but it was a planned economic arrangement." And if the children were not actually siblings, then the family was being tricked, Robert said. But more importantly, the children were being used. If they were told they were twins, or if they were simply told to pose as twins, they were being forced into a fake identity for the benefit of the agency. Their real histories, their real families were being erased. Margaret sat with that thought for a long moment. She thought about Lena's mother in the prison, perhaps not even knowing where her daughter was. She thought about Dorothy's mother in the hospital, too sick to speak up for her child. Both girls had been taken from their families, not because of abuse or bad care, but because of poverty and bad luck, and then they had been repackaged as a success story. She asked Robert what he knew about what happened to children placed by agencies like this. It varied a lot, he said. Some children were treated well and genuinely adopted into families. Others were worked like servants, denied school, and returned to the agency when they became too old or too sick to be useful. There are recorded stories from survivors who describe being passed from family to family, never staying anywhere long enough to form bonds, always knowing they were there to work. The agencies called it Christian charity. The children called it something else. Margaret thanked Robert and went back to her office at the Historical Society. She wrote up what she found and sent a memo to her boss, a man named Gerald Pritchard, who directed the photography and prints department. She explained what she had found and suggested an exhibition that would show the photograph within the larger history of child welfare corruption in Chicago during that era. Gerald called her into his office 3 days later. He had the memo on his desk along with copies of the photograph and the supporting documents. He looked uncomfortable. "This is excellent research," he said. "But I need to think carefully about how we show this. The Illinois Home Finding Association closed nearly a century ago, but some of the families involved were famous. The Trimble family, for example, still has relatives who give money to this institution. I don't want to create unnecessary trouble." Margaret kept her voice steady. "The trouble already exists," she said. "It's in the photograph. We've been displaying this image and others like it as charming examples of early studio photography. We've been involved in the clean story these agencies wanted to project. If we don't tell the truth now, we're continuing that involvement." Gerald sighed. "I understand your position, but we have to be smart. We can't just put up an exhibition that accuses a donor's great-grandfather of using children. We need to frame this carefully, focus on the system's issues, not the individuals. The system's issues were created and kept up by individuals." Margaret said, "Reverend Trimble ran this agency. He wrote the letters. He ordered the photographs. He signed the contracts. We can't tell the story of the system without naming the people who built it." Gerald rubbed his forehead. "Let me talk to the board. In the meantime, keep researching, find more examples. If we're going to do this, we need to prove that this was a common practice, not a one-time event." Margaret spent the next month in archives across the city. She found similar photographs from other agencies, images of children posed with farming tools or standing beside well-dressed families, captions that highlighted their change from poor orphans to productive members of society. She found contracts stating that children as young as 6 would work a minimum of 8 hours per day in house service. She found letters from families demanding the return of children who had become sick or refused to work. She also found resistance in the records of a Black Baptist church on the South Side. She discovered a folder of letters written by a pastor named Reverend James Mitchell in the early 1920s. Mitchell had organized a group of parents and community members to challenge the placement practices of agencies like the Illinois Home Finding Association, arguing that they targeted Black and immigrant children more often and that the so-called Christian homes were often places of misuse and abuse. His letters had been sent to city officials, state lawmakers, and the governor. Most had gone unanswered. One letter dated 1922 included a list of children from his church who had been removed from their families and placed by various agencies. He wrote, "These children are not orphans. They have parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles who love them and want them home. But because we are poor and because we are black, the courts have decided we are unfit. The agencies say they are saving these children. We say they are stealing them." Margaret copied Mitchell's letters and added them to her research file. She contacted a professor of African American history at DePaul University who studied black aid networks and learned that Mitchell's church had been part of a larger movement of black institutions that tried to protect their children from the child welfare system by creating their own foster networks and legal defense funds. The movement had mostly failed because it lacked the political power and money of the white-led agencies, but it had left a paper trail of fighting back. Margaret returned to Gerald Pritchard with her expanded research. She showed him Mitchell's letters and the records from other agencies. She argued that the exhibition needed to center the voices of people like Reverend Mitchell, people who had seen the system for what it was and had tried to fight back. Gerald agreed to set up a meeting with the board's exhibitions committee. Margaret prepared a presentation and waited. The meeting took place in a conference room on the 4th floor of the Historical Society building. 6 board members attended along with Gerald and 2 other curators. Margaret projected the photograph of Lena and Dorothy onto the screen and walked through her findings step by step. She explained the shoes, the fake sibling relationship, and the advertising purpose of the image. She showed the contracts and the letters. She quoted Reverend Mitchell's letters. One board member, a retired lawyer named William Crenshaw, interrupted her. "I appreciate how thorough this research is," he said, "but I'm worried about what this implies. Are we saying that every family who took in a child through these agencies was using them? Because I know for a fact that some of these placements resulted in real adoptions and loving homes." "I'm not saying every family was abusive," Margaret replied. "I'm saying the system was unfair by design. The agencies treated children like products. They advertised them as sources of labor. They staged photographs to trick donors and future families. Some children may have ended up in good situations, but that doesn't change the fact that the system treated them as economic assets rather than human beings with rights and families of their own." Another board member, a wealthy donor named Eleanor Hartley, spoke up. "What about the children's voices? Do we have any direct accounts from Lena or Dorothy? Do we know what happened to them after this photograph was taken?" Margaret shook her head. "I've tried to trace them, but the records are incomplete. Lena Moyer disappears from public records after 1919. Dorothy Kowalski appears in the 1930 census as a house servant living with a family in Evanston, but I have no way of knowing if that was a placement that became permanent or if she was still effectively working as unpaid labor. Without spoken histories or personal papers, we have to rely on the institutional records, and those records are designed to hide as much as they reveal. Then we should be careful about our claims," Crenshaw said. "We can present the photograph and explain the context, but we should avoid making accusations we can't fully prove." Margaret felt her frustration rising. "The agency's own records prove the unfair treatment," she said. "The contracts, the letters, the photographs themselves are evidence. We don't need a direct testimony to say that dressing up 2 unrelated children as twins and advertising them as a double labor placement was wrong. The evidence speaks for itself." Gerald stepped in. "I think what William is saying is that we need to be mindful of how we present this to the public. We're not writing a paper for a university. We're creating an exhibition that will be seen by thousands of people, including families and school groups. We need to be clear and factual without trying to start a fight. Telling the truth is not starting a fight." Margaret said quietly, "It's necessary." The room fell silent for a moment. Then Eleanor Hartley spoke again. "I support moving forward with the exhibition," she said, "but I think we should include modern voices if possible. Are there groups working on child welfare today that could provide context about how these past practices connect to current issues? Are there descendants of children placed by these agencies who might want to share their family stories? Margaret nodded. I can reach out to child welfare support groups and family history societies. I've already found one community historian on the South Side who is researching families impacted by forced placements. I'll contact her. The board discussed details for another 30 minutes, then voted to approve the exhibition with the understanding that Margaret would continue her outreach efforts and that the final text would be reviewed by a historian of child welfare to ensure accuracy. Margaret left the meeting feeling both relieved and tired. She had won the argument, but she knew the real work was just beginning. She spent the next 2 months building the exhibition. She contacted child welfare organizations and learned that the practices of the Illinois Home Finding Association, while extreme in their photo staging, were not unusual for the time. Thousands of children had been placed in homes where they were expected to work without pay, often under the name of adoption or Christian charity. The practice had continued in various forms well into the mid-20th century, renamed as foster care, but still fundamentally shaped by money decisions about the value of children's labor. She also contacted a family researcher named Denise Patterson, who had been researching black families in Chicago who had lost children to the placement system. Denise put her in touch with an elderly woman named Gladys Washington, whose aunt had been placed by the Illinois Home Finding Association in 1917. Gladys agreed to be interviewed for the exhibition. In the interview recorded in Gladys's living room on a warm afternoon in September, Gladys spoke about her aunt, a girl named Ruth, who had been taken from the family after Gladys's grandmother was arrested for working in an illegal bar during Prohibition. Ruth had been sent to a farm downstate and forced to work in the fields and in the kitchen. She had tried to run away twice and been returned by the police. She had finally been released at age 16 after her contract ended and had returned to Chicago. She had never spoken in detail about her years on the farm, but she had never married and never wanted children of her own. She used to say they stole her childhood, Gladys said. That's the word she used, stole. The agency told my grandmother they were saving Ruth, giving her opportunities she wouldn't have in the city. But what they really wanted was free labor. And when Ruth came back, she was different, harder. She didn't trust anyone. Margaret included parts of Gladys's interview in the exhibition text alongside the photograph of Lena and Dorothy. She wrote captions that explained the shoes, the fake sibling relationship, and the wider context of child placement as labor misuse. She included Reverend Mitchell's letters and documents from other agencies showing similar practices. She also included modern facts on children in the foster care system and the ongoing challenges of protecting children from misuse within state care. The exhibition opened in January 2023. It was titled Hidden Labor, Children and the Business of Reform in Progressive-Era Chicago. The photograph of Lena and Dorothy was the main piece, displayed on the wall with a magnified section showing their mismatched shoes. The opening party was crowded. Descendants of placed children attended, some seeing images of their relatives for the first time. Scholars and social workers came to see the documents. Journalists from local news outlets covered the story. Margaret stood near the photograph and watched visitors lean in close, studying the shoes, reading the captions, understanding what it meant. One visitor, a woman in her late 60s, stood in front of the photograph for a long time. Finally, she approached Margaret and introduced herself as Karen Lindstrom. She said her grandmother had been placed by the Illinois Home Finding Association in 1920 at age 7 and had worked as a house servant for a family in Oak Park until she was 18. Her grandmother had told stories about being photographed for the agency's ads, about being dressed in clothes that were not hers and told to smile for strangers. She said she never felt real in those photographs. Karen told Margaret. She said they turned her into a prop. When I saw this picture, I thought of her. Those girls look just like she described. Pretty dresses, fake smiles, and something wrong in the details, if you look close enough. Margaret thanked Karen for sharing her grandmother's story and invited her to contribute to the exhibition's spoken history collection. Karen agreed. In the weeks following the opening, the exhibition received a lot of attention. Several descendants of Reverend Harold Trimble contacted the Historical Society asking for the exhibition to be changed or removed, arguing that it unfairly attacked their ancestor. Gerald Pritchard met with them and explained that the exhibition was based on documented evidence and that the Historical Society had a duty to present historical truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable. The descendants threatened to stop their donations. The board stood behind the exhibition. A local newspaper ran a feature story titled "The Children Chicago Forgot: How Progressive Era Reform Hid Exploitation." The story quoted Margaret extensively and included the photograph of Lena and Dorothy. The article caused other archives and museums to re-examine their own collections for similar images and materials. Margaret received emails from researchers across the country who had found similar photographs in their institutions. Images of children posed to look like something they were not. Images designed to sell a story that had little to do with the children's actual experiences. She began building a database of these images, working toward a larger project that would document the national scope of child placement as a form of labor misuse. She also finally traced what had happened to Lena Moyer through a combination of census records, city directories, and cemetery records. She learned that Lena had been placed with a family in rural Illinois in 1919, had worked for them until 1924, and had then moved to Indiana, where she had worked in a hotel laundry. She had married briefly in her 30s, but the marriage had ended. She had died in 1967 in a county nursing home with no children and no listed survivors. Her death certificate listed her job as domestic worker. Dorothy Kowalski's trail was harder to follow, but Margaret eventually found a death record from 1953 in Milwaukee. Dorothy had worked as a housekeeper for various families throughout her life. She had never married. Her death certificate listed a niece as the informant, suggesting that she had kept some connection to her original family, but Margaret could find no further paper trail of that relationship. Margaret included these findings in a follow-up article published in a history journal. She wrote, "Lena Moyer and Dorothy Kowalski were photographed together in 1919 to create the look of a successful sibling placement. In reality, they were two unrelated girls whose childhoods were interrupted by poverty, family crisis, and a child welfare system that valued them mostly as sources of labor." Their mismatched shoes, barely visible in the original photograph, are the only evidence that survived of their separate identities. For decades, viewers looked at this image and saw twins, saw success, saw charity. Only by looking closely at the details the system could not fully control. Can we begin to see the truth? The photograph remains on display at the Chicago Historical Society. Visitors still lean in to study the shoes. School groups use the image as a starting point for discussions about historical evidence and the ways institutions shape stories. Margaret occasionally leads tours and talks about the research process, about learning to read photographs carefully, about the ethical duty to question the stories that comfortable people tell about uncomfortable histories. But the photograph itself asks no questions. Lena and Dorothy stand frozen in their white dresses, arms linked, smiling at the camera the way they were told to smile. The shoes are still mismatched. The truth is still there, hidden in plain sight for more than a century, waiting for someone to notice what the Illinois Home Finding Association could not quite erase. The canvas and the leather, the institutional and the borrowed, the two girls who were never twins, but who were bound together anyway by a system that saw children as problems to be solved and labor to be harvested. And that system did not end in 1919. It changed, it adapted, it found new language and new reasons. But the photographs remain scattered through archives and albums and estate sales, waiting to tell their stories to anyone willing to look closely enough to see the details that do not match.